Thank you so much. It's a great privilege for me to be back at Wheaton. It's a privilege to be at Hastert Center to see the work that's been done by Bill Pollard and others in establishing the Center for your leadership in the inaugural year. Javier, greetings everybody. And as you said, my grandfather was a professor here at the college. He himself was a public servant in Washington, D.C. He worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce in Washington and edited the U.S. Survey of Business, which is still published. And as a public servant, he wanted to have his children educated at Wheaton. And he moved here, as some of you know well, and some of you were in his home. I can see a number of friends who knew him well and knew my parents well. Were in his home in Mississippi, having the breaking of bread and other communion. And because he knew public affairs well, as Bill Pollard was saying earlier, yes?
Just for 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Fix this
Not at all.
so it sounds good on the recording for us. Let me just stick it on here.
Yeah, sure.
Facing out.
All right.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Continue.
All right. So pardon me. So he came here to the college, and then the college asked him to teach, and he did. And I had the good fortune, like Timothy in the Bible, to have parents and grandparents who were believers. I had the good fortune to meet my wife at Wheaton. She's here somewhere. I didn't see where she was sitting just when. Where are you, sweetheart? There she is over there, my wife. And so many wonderful friends. Of course, I studied right here in Blanchard Hall, as generations have done for a long time, and it's really a privilege to be back here. Come on in, please. You know, there's a book that a number of you may be familiar with, written by two University of Chicago professors, economists, and the book is entitled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. Are you familiar with this book? Well, the thesis of the book is that capitalism as a system has the potential for great good. And I think that it's in recent years, even in the years that I've been able to travel around the world, this has been fairly well established that in terms of the alternative systems in the world, it's capitalism that has the potential to do the best job of delivering quality goods and services and grow the economies of the world for the good of human beings. And if we look back over the last 200 years, and even in a good bit of the world in only the last 20 years, we can see some very positive benefits of a market system and the benefits of the market system. On the other hand, these economists have identified, in spite of the potential for great good, markets are actually very fragile, particularly financial markets. And this book was written several years before the financial crisis. And they recognized that for capitalism to work and for markets, in particular financial markets, to work well, there need to be rules. There need to be a close attention paid to public policy so that the potential good of markets can in fact flourish, and humans can in fact flourish as a result. Now, many of you know that Adam Smith himself, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, it was published same year as the U.S. Declaration of Independence, talked about in his tome that actually capitalists tend to prefer to collude rather than compete. Why, he said? Well, because it's much easier. Competing is hard. And what makes the market system work is good competition that ultimately delivers the kind of goods to humankind that are good. But capitalists, Adam Smith said, actually prefer. Come on in, Grace. Thank you very much. I appreciate Javier had me on did a lot of talking today. It was just a real treat. It's just an interruption from the theory of Adam Smith while I open up this water to say that it was a real treat to all of you who leadership of the college, the deans and faculty that are here to be with Wheaton students today. That was a real privilege. Thank you for the work you do to attract and train and develop students, some of whom are here tonight. But anyway, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists goes on to say that unfortunately, often it's the very people who are competing in the system who might work so that the system can't work for the good of humankind overall. And so tonight I wanted to talk to you about fulfilling the high calling of business leadership, which is entitled Human Flourishing. That is, the purpose of business is not to deliver the numbers, to deliver the money, but that humans would flourish. And what we found in looking at systems all around the world is that the way that humans best flourish in terms of their economic systems is to create an opportunity for people to make profit. But of course, if capitalists are the very ones who will wreck the system, then they would be the ones who would prevent the good of the system being spread around the world. And of course, since the book has been written, we have seen how markets in fact are very fragile. And I think most of us can be quite proud of, although we wish it wasn't necessary, but when the financial systems of the world came to the abyss on October 17th, about 18 months ago, the authorities around the world acted not perfectly, but acted in ways that brought the kind of liquidity and only the full faith and credit of governments could really restore the confidence in the markets that had been lost. So the question is how do we as Christians fulfill that high calling? Is it a high calling? Well, I would assert to you that there are multiple high callings, of course, multiple ways to serve. But certainly if you can serve in a way that brings flourishing to other human beings all around the world, that is a high calling. And I actually have some underpinnings that I gained here at Wheaton and then beyond that I would like to share with you tonight about why it was that I was convinced that humans could flourish and that the business system, a business career could be used to bring glory to God. Now, that doesn't mean there are not a lot of other ways that the humans can't flourish or other high callings besides business. I'm just going to talk about this particular one, which is the one that I have followed. So before I do that, I want to just tell you a little bit about my time at John Deere, because that puts the context. And as Javier said, I just retired as chairman. I had the privilege, after working there for 28 years, to lead the company for about a decade. And during that period of time, I'll just give you 4 themes that I emphasized as the leader of the company. And that theme will then put into context what was accomplished. And then what I like to do is step behind that. That's all very much public information. I'm just going to try to summarize it for you here briefly. But then I'd like to step behind and talk to you about 2 individuals who influenced me greatly. Known to many of you, if not most of you in the room. There could be many that could be mentioned, in this room even. But I have to limit it, because Javier said 3 hours was the length of the lecture, right? So I had to limit it to 2. So I've just picked out these 2, and then I will tell you, I'll give you 5 points about how the underpinnings that I picked out from these thought leaders and thinkers have provided the underpinnings to what I did at Deere, which of course is not really public information. I don't really talk about that all that often. I think it's implicit in what I do, but I would like to share with you tonight here at Wheaton more explicitly what some of those underpinnings were, and continue to be in my current role of really providing oversight. I'm kind of in the oversight business now of, on boards of directors. But anyway, at Deere, John Deere, most of you know John Deere is a global manufacturer of agricultural and construction and forestry equipment and provides financial services for those products, and sells really all around the world and manufactures all around the world. But during the period of time that I was there were really 4 themes, and I'll just try to highlight these sufficiently to give you a taste, but not any more than that. But the first thing we did was we had very distinctive aspirations. That is, very high aspirations and very specific aspirations of what the corporation could accomplish. After all, this is a corporation that's been around since 1837. It's about 160 years old when I had the privilege to lead it. A lot of good things. Very few companies last that long. So a lot of good things had been done. But we recognize that the competition in the world, which of course is part of what this capitalist system is supposed to bring, is a lot of competition, that just from the time I graduated from Wheaton, which was same year as my wife Patty in 1972, about half of the big names, the top names of American business, had disappeared. That's really quite remarkable when you figure these great names had not survived. And there was no guarantee that John Deere would survive either. There's no guarantee, just because we had had a long history. Many of these other names, and of course since that time, even in the last few years, a lot of other well-known names have also now been acquired or have disappeared, sadly, gone bankrupt. But we had distinctive aspiration to dramatically take the business performance to a totally new level so that we could compete effectively for the new competition in the world and make it to our 200th birthday 28 years from now and prosper and thrive and deliver great products to customers. So we set out a goal that we would perform really on average better than our previous best, which was a very tall order. And put it another way, for those of you who follow these things, we were when markets were very strong, we were basically covering our cost of capital. We set out to say, instead of just covering our cost of capital when markets were strong, we would essentially attempt to cover our cost of capital when markets were weak. And in our types of businesses, markets are sometimes very strong and sometimes very weak. This was a huge shift because historically these kinds of businesses had hemorrhaged when markets were weak. And so it was just this ongoing cycle. And so we set out with very distinctive aspirations. And to do that, we said that numbers only are reflective. The financial numbers we sought to accomplish were reflective. In other words, no light. A reflector doesn't have light, right? It shines when other light is there. The moon is a reflector, right? No light of its own. That's what financial numbers are. What they reflect are great work with customers. And especially over the long run. Over the long run, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to deliver good financial numbers if you're not doing great work with customers over the long run. It just can't be done. And of course, the way you do great work with customers is you need to do great work with your employees. Because if you're going to deliver superb business customer experiences to customers all around the world, you're going to have to do great work with your employees. So to deliver this kind of financial performance, there had to be tremendous new aspirations for serving customers and serving employees. So distinctive aspirations. Secondly was gritty ethics. And by that I mean the ethics rubbed. In other words, this was not just something that was wrapped on. This was something that rubbed. This was something that was marbled through our organization. Now let me just tell you, our company had a history of strong ethics, but you have to be very vigilant in this area. And so in my case, what I did was every letter for 10 years that I ever wrote or any document, there was only one word that was ever underlined. It was the word how, H-O-W. So how we did business, and I always underline that. And pretty soon people would begin to say, well, what is this how? How do we do business? the answer was, well, at John Deere, wherever we are, whether we're in China, India, Kazakhstan, Argentina, China, it's no tricks, no smoke, no mirrors, right down the middle, totally transparent. What we do can be published in the newspaper, your home newspaper, the New York Times, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, or the Tokyo Shimbun, wherever you are, in the newspaper. This is quite a strong test. And so pretty soon employees began to say, there's a brand, this is the how, this is how we do things. And of course many companies say a lot of good words about ethics. And so what's really important is what you actually do and what they observe you do and what the whole management team does. And so over the course of the 10 years, the how became an absolute, and of course at the company we weren't perfect. The company was made up of people like me, not perfect people. But there was an aspiration to have ethics at the absolute pinnacle of what we were doing. And pretty soon this how became ubiquitous across the company. And everybody talked about, we can't get that done because of the how. And of course we still worked very hard to have the performance. Very rarely did we not get it. It's just that we had to get it in the right way. But this rubbed. And sometimes the issues were complex. And it wasn't easy to sort out exactly how we were going to apply this. What happens when we have to let employees go, when we have to change dealers. You've probably read how some of the auto companies just slash dealers, with an axe. Well, we were actually having a very orderly reduction in dealers over the course of the whole decade, so that it was done orderly. People were getting fair deals. It wasn't always easy, but the same effect was there, but with a totally different outcome in terms of attitudes of employees. That's the sort of gritty ethics that need to be done. We still have to deliver the performance. Thirdly, there was uncommon teamwork. The thought was that most people at Deere were like me. Just what I would say, talented. I'm fortunate to have been blessed with talent, but common talent. Most of us were like that. And we had a few geniuses among us, which was very nice, but most of us were just normally talented people. And the idea was if we would all pull together, normally talented people will outperform a set of geniuses who were pulling in different directions every time. And so we worked very hard to say that we were going to be pulling and working in the same direction. Now that doesn't mean you want to have, you have to be careful here, because of course you could have just groupthink. But we wanted to have a lot of disagreement. So we had the motto, to think is to differ. And every time someone would disagree with me, I would try, sometimes this was hard, I would thank them for the disagreement in the management team, for example, and try to reward that. And there was a reward. Pretty soon the team was working quite well together. And I would say that was the secret sauce over the decade. If we were to talk to employees around the world, people at the United Auto Workers or others would say that getting employees to work together. This is nothing new for many of you here at Wheaton, those of you who are students here. You're working together on sports teams, you're working together in drama productions, you're working together in all kinds of things. That same kind of cooperation was what was attempted to be done across our global workforce, which included Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Orthodox in Russia, let's say, and Roman Catholics and Protestants and fundamentalists and atheists and agnostics, whatever the background, all pulling together in a common teamwork to deliver quality products to customers. And finally, I would say integrated metrics. And that was everything was attempted to be measured, and metrics were rigorous and were applied everywhere. So we had kind of an Uber metric, which was meeting this cost of capital metric, and then there were all kinds of metrics underneath that all integrated and worked together. And of course, this is easy to say, but tough to do. But when people start having metrics that mesh and work together over the course of a decade, you can begin to deliver. So we had the opportunity to apply our plans over the decade, and course, we didn't necessarily want to have a big fall off, but last year, business was down more than it had been down ever in history. It's certainly in the last 50 years, in both absolute and percentage terms at the top line. So we had a huge fall off. And yet, fortunately, because of the planning and the work that the team had done, the company continued to perform quite well and, in fact, met its objectives that we had set. And this was well recognized by Wall Street because this was a totally different kind of company that could meet its cost of capital at the bottom. And now this gave great opportunity, as it happened early in the decade, of performing. When you're doing that at the bottom, you can perform dramatically better at the top. And of course, that was a reflection, remember, a reflection of a product that was built to meet the needs of our customers, whether they were in Argentina or Kazakhstan or Nigeria or wherever it was. So this was work for the company. This is what you can read about if you were to dig into the company, what my fellow employees knew about. But what was it that I learned in my life that I really want to kind of share with you about that helped me believe that serving in this way was a high calling and very appropriate for a Christian? Well, the two individuals that, among the many who influenced me that I want to talk to you about, will be no strangers to many of you. They both spoke with a British accent. One was right here, Professor, Chairman of the Department of Philosophy when I was here, Dr. Holmes. Okay? Won't be a surprise to many of you. And the other, not a surprise to many of you, was Dr. John Stott, who was an Anglican minister in London, and of course well published. Many of you have read many of his books. Well, I would like to share with you 5 specific scriptures that have tended to animate in my life and talk about how these two men helped unpack those scriptures for me. And then I think what you can see, I'll try to connect them, but I think you'll be able to connect how those themes ended up helping me to deliver in doing my job in running the company. And so this was a great gift that I got from these men and others. And of course, the gift itself came from God because they were unpacking the scriptures. So what were these 5 scriptures anyway? Pretty straightforward, very well known to you. But the first one, and the first 2 in fact, are ones that kind of came alive to me through Dr. Holmes. Now I hope I represent these 2 men properly. If I don't, it's my fault. I will attempt to represent them properly. This was my understanding of what they taught. Hopefully they would agree. But the first scripture was from 1 Corinthians, where Paul says that we know in part, and see through a glass darkly. And this is, of course, something that Dr. Holmes talked about in his epistemology class, how do we know? And the idea that we would know in part and see through a glass darkly was a very, very helpful perspective in coming at all of the cultures of the world, all of the different ideas in the world, to recognize that we didn't have to have epistemic or despair in our knowledge, but epistemological modesty in our assertions of what we could know. It didn't mean we had to despair, but we didn't necessarily see through the glass totally clearly. Well, this really has helped me because it takes an approach of listening to other people, what their thoughts may be. How do they understand the world that we are working together in? And that thought has come back over and over again of knowing in part and seeing through the glass darkly. Fortunately, not despair, but modesty in what we can know. Secondly, Dr. Holmes also talked a great deal. Many of you heard him and studied under him like I did, and that was the famous words of Genesis, where God looked at what he made. We don't know just how he made, but what he did when he made, he said, "It is good." And over again, you can read in the early chapters of Genesis that he said it was good. And actually, Dr. Holmes introduced to me the idea that God created ex nihilo, created out of nothing. And the creation was separate from God himself, and so when he looked at this creation, this material world that we are part of, that was in itself good. So this is a wonderfully freeing concept, that this matter here, C.S. Lewis says, God loves matter. After all, he made it. And so the idea that what's here, what God made, was intrinsically in itself good. And so you look around the world and you see the different cultures where you're working, privileged to, as you can imagine, in the countries I work, the different cultures, the music, the art, the traditions, all of them as they reflected the creation were intrinsically in themselves good. And this was a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now, unfortunately, being that this was a separate from God, what was made intrinsically good, we know, and many have said this is perhaps the most empirically provable part of the Bible, and that is that it's distorted. There's evil. Things have gone wrong in that good, but still intrinsically good creation. And this is where the good news of Jesus Christ comes in, that God came into the world to restore what he had made. Abraham Kuyper said, the Dutch theologian and practical leader, parliament leader, I believe, in the Netherlands, said that although the creation had been covered with this dust, it was our task to help take that dust away so that its original brilliancy could glitter, that creation could glitter in its brilliancy. And it was our task to work, even though there's a tarnish that remains, to have that goodness seen. Well, as you work in whatever the products are that you're working with in business and working with people all around the world, this is a wonderfully exciting concept that which has been made, we as human beings, people all around the world of all types, and where they're living, what they're doing, what their cultures are, and so forth, has this intrinsic goodness in it, and it allows us to celebrate that with cultures and people all around the world. So I think you can see those first two concepts I just mentioned, how they kind of provide underpinnings for those aspirations that I had articulated to the board, to the company. So anyway, what about the third one? The third one I wanted to share with you also comes from Genesis, but this comes from the 12th chapter of Genesis. And these first three verses in the 12th chapter of Genesis is where God calls Abraham. And Dr. Stott says that these verses are the most unifying verses, these three verses, the most unifying verses in the Bible. They are the key that unlocks the Scriptures. Now that's high praise, right, for three verses. Well, the reason is because here is where God says, and the phrase is that through Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. All the families. And so, when you think back to that time, and then you roll the movie forward, and then you see in the book of Revelation that people from every tribe, nation, tongue, more than can be numbered, more than the salt, and I think Abraham was promised that these would be more than the salt of the sea, the sand of the beach. These were the families that would be blessed. And from eternity past to eternity future, all of the families would be blessed. And that was the good news of what God was doing. So therefore, to be engaged with people all around the world and seeing that they were going to be part of the blessing is wonderfully encouraging and exciting to open up and see that you're a part of that much larger task. Which reminds me of the story, which many of you might have heard, of the cathedral. And the three people were chipping away at building for the cathedral. And the foreman went to the first worker and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm chipping stone." You've probably heard this. The second one, you go, what are you doing? Well, I'm chipping stone, but I'm earning a living for my family so I can take care of my children. That's a noble, that's more than just chipping stone. The third one, what are you doing? Well, I'm chipping stone. I'm building a living for my family, and I'm crafting a piece for Notre Dame. A stone for Notre Dame that's going to go into that wonderful cathedral. Now, all three were doing the same thing, right? All three workers were doing exactly the same task, but they had three different attitudes. And basically, the third one is what fits into this idea that all the families of the earth were going to be blessed through what God was going to do. That is something that you can get excited about, doing your own part of the chipping. So then, if you move to a fourth verse, that is the verse that John Stott talks about often, and that is that we are the salt of the earth. Many have spoken about this, of course, from the Beatitudes in Matthew. And the idea that salt, a very small amount of salt, as you all know, can both preserve and flavor. And you know those words, is that if the salt has lost its flavor, what good is it? The salt is terribly important. And so the idea that we are salt in bringing preservation to the meat. Don't blame, John Stott says, don't blame the meat when it goes bad. Blame the salt that you didn't get it rubbed in to preserve it. Don't blame the meat if there's not flavor. Where's the salt? We are the salt. And that's a wonderful, wonderful teaching from Jesus. And finally, Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God. And John Stott makes what for me was very helpful. Because many people say, well, how can you have ambition? How can you have ambition if your goal is to be a servant? And at the same time, how you could be ambitious to lead a company? Well, John Stott talks about the prime ambition, which is to bring glory to God. Seek first the kingdom of God. That's the overarching ambition. But having the overarching ambition, he uses the words, and I found this very helpful for the last 30 years, secondary ambitions that support the primary ambition. And those secondary ambitions are things that, if they're supporting the first one, can be pursued with great vigor. And so the idea that we would have an aspiration to deliver very high quality products to people that improve their lives, help them flourish, this is a secondary ambition supporting the first ambition, the overarching ambition of seeking first the kingdom of God. So these were 5 animating verses that impacted me as unpacked by Dr. Stott and Dr. Holmes. And I think that you can look and see that when we think about business as a way to take the earth's goods, transform them into products that meet people's needs, transform them in ways that are preserving of the earth, that God created, this good earth. If God cared so much about this earth that He wanted to restore it, this creation, we certainly can care a great deal about it to also, as we are co-restorers with God in fulfilling this aspiration. And so as the hunger students today were telling us, Paul, about, or Dr. Robinson, about the seeing so much sadness and so much, some of you have been there in other ways, and we see the evil in the world, and we see the fact that what was created good has been distorted. When we see that, it can be a wonderful secondary ambition to say we're going to preserve and take care of this earth, and we're going to find ways. We're going to invest in technology. We're going to invest in systems. We're going to invest in processes that end up improving people's lives, improving all people's lives, wherever they are in the world. And of course, today we sit here and we know that there are roughly 6 to 6.5 billion people in the world. And probably 2 billion of them are living on less than $2 a day. That doesn't sound like those families are really being blessed yet. And roughly between $1 and $2 a day, many of you probably know this. This is when you tend to be able to improve your diets. And that's when you're having that type of income. When you get a little bit more money, you don't say, well, I really like to have a little bigger house. If you're hungry, it doesn't really matter how big your house is, right? You're going to invest in food. Whereas most of us here are blessed to have enough food that if your income goes up, you're not going to change a lot what you eat, right? So at this level, when incomes go up, most of the people in this room, or in Western Europe, let's say, or Japan, or other parts of the world, that doesn't tend to happen. But for that billion people, roughly in the middle there's a huge need for people to be able to eat better. And then we have 2 billion there. And now we have another 2 billion, 2 to 3 billion that are going to be born over the next 40 years. Demographers think that we will level off at about 9 billion. But demographics is one of the most predictable sciences that there is. And so think of, when we talk about all the families of the earth being blessed, the opportunities to look at the high calling of business, which is one of the many high callings, but the opportunity to bring quality products and services to all of these people, I find really can be very energizing and very helpful in setting those distinctive aspirations, working on those gritty ethics that reflect the earth, and insisting on pulling together in uncommon teamwork and having the kind of integrated metrics that allow you to deliver. So this is kind of how I thought about my job. Now, when I was introduced, it was mentioned that my grandfather taught at Wheaton, and the scripture that I heard most from my grandfather and my father, who read this, was Psalm 121, which they would read regularly. And those words, as you might recall, I'll lift up mine eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. Who is this? The Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And before he was Redeemer, he was Creator. And then, of course, he is also Redeemer. And the ultimate end is to give glory to God, the maker of heaven and earth. And so, as I think about my daily work, I think about, where does the help come from? Well, the help comes from the maker of heaven and earth. And giving glory to him is the ultimate objective. And then helping humans flourish is a way to give this glory to God, and through business is one of the ways that this can happen. So it was a great privilege for me to sort of share this little autobiographical account with you. Thank you for listening. And now, if you would like, I would like to open it up for any comments or questions. Thank you. Yes. Yes, sir.
Given the corporate culture that existed while you ran John Deere, what kind of trials and tribulations did you personally face that were brought to you as you had to compete on an international level?
Well, I think that's a great observation, that one of the reasons for wanting to take the performance up to such higher levels was because the global competition, the global competitive environment is getting much more intense. In departing the company, I shared with my colleagues and with the board that in my judgment, I shared this at the annual meeting, so you can read this online, is that my judgment, the company will face the most difficult competitive environment they've ever faced in its long 172-year history. And as we get to our 200th birthday, we will face the toughest competitive environment that we're going to face, because all of these people that I talked about, as their wealth begins to grow in Vietnam and Thailand and Ecuador and in Ukraine and wherever you are in the world, they will also provide competition for us. The world is, for example, very specifically to Deere, is going to be filled with Indian and Chinese tractors. The question is going to be, are they going to be from our point of view, are they going to be John Deere tractors out of India, which so far we're the leading exporter to 66 countries out of India? Are they going to be John Deere tractors out of China? They're going to be someone else's tractors. So that is the type of view. Now, in addition to me saying we're going to face the toughest competition, I also shared with the board and with the team that I also think there'll be the greatest opportunities ever faced. There will never be another time, for those of you who are just starting at your career, the next 40 years is going to be something will never be repeated, most likely. And that is this next surge of population, adding another 2 to 3 billion people in the world, will probably never happen again. And by the time you maybe finish your careers, that population surge may be pretty much over. And the world will level off at obviously a much greater size than it is today. But that's a remarkable, unique situation that, for example, your grandchildren, which you may not be thinking much about right now, but won't have, because the world will probably level off at that point. That's what most people think will happen. So greatest competition, greatest opportunities. Now, in that period in India, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, because I had the privilege to share this with quite a few students today, but in India, Deere had nothing, and in the year 2000. And today, or starting that year, we now export to 66 countries. And so if we didn't, we would be inundated with our competitive products coming out of India. Good products, good companies. When we began to compete in that area, the leader of the leading competitive company was a graduate of the Harvard Business School. And that's not bad, Henry, is it? And I hired McKinsey, a top-notch consulting firm, to come in and prepare them to compete against us. But fortunately, we are there. But if we hadn't, we would really be hurting. A little bit like GM was when Honda and Toyota came in and there was no preparation. Same thing in China. Whereas today we are, competing there. So that's just one example of many that I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could define the core competencies of the individuals that made up your most high-functioning teams that you fostered at John Deere.
Yes, thank you. This lady would like for me to define the core competencies of the team, of the people that made up the high-performing teams that I worked with. It's a good question. Well, I would say one of the competencies was they had to have the talent to work together, which is a very important. Several people asked me today that I had a chance to interview, said, what would you say in an interview? I said, well, one of the things I look for, and I'm sure other leaders do too, is not just raw talent, but talent to work together. Because just raw talent, if it can't work together, now if you're a golfer, you don't really need to work together. Just raw talent works pretty well. But if those of you who play basketball or soccer here, or football in Spanish, would recognize that playing together is terribly important. So in a company situation like this, where we're working around the world, so let's take our combine team. You asked about a team. We build combines in Horizontina, Brazil, in Zweibrücken, Germany, I've forgotten already, this isn't good, I'm showing I'm retired, in China, I can't recall the city, and in East Moline, Illinois. Those 4 factories are built in Jiangsu, China. Well, the people in all of those 4 working around the world in different cultures, that ability to work together is critically important. They may be extremely talented, but if they can't make that talent work together, so that's probably number one. And number two is, of course, they have to be very good at what they're doing. You know, when we are selling these are high, you know, a combine harvester has 17,000 parts in it, and the diesel engine is one part there. This is a very complex machine. It's being run today by GPS. Today our tractors, you can sit in there and read the newspaper or work on the internet, and the tractor will come along, it will lift up what's planting there, turn itself, the computer will optimize how it's planted. So these are becoming very smart machines. So we can't have people who are, you know, we need the people that have the kind of science training, for example, that comes from the rigorous academic departments here. We also need in all fields. I just picked the sciences there, but of course we need that in all areas, in human resources, you know, HR, the human resources. We have to have programs that make sense. How is the person paid in China against India versus Brazil versus how is the engineer being paid over against the marketing person? Just as an example, and those of you who are working in business know that. So those are just examples. People have to be very good at their particular field, but that's not enough. That's a necessary condition, and then it has to be sufficient to kind of work together. I hope that's helpful. Yes, please.
What have been some of the most encouraging examples of human flourishing that you've seen through your work and time at John Deere?
The question was, what are some of the examples I've seen of human flourishing around the world? You know, I think you would all agree that human beings, wherever they are, like to have a purpose in what they're doing. You know, and those of you who in the room are students of all the different cultures, at least my observation, I had the privilege to work in many, many cultures around the world, this seems to be common, is that people like to know what they're doing. Why am I doing? I'm not a robot. I don't want to just do something with a bag over my head. It may be the same task. I want to know why I'm doing this. I want to know how it contributes, what it's doing. And so when you see people understanding what they're doing, how they're contributing to a common project, it's remarkable how satisfied the feeling is when you can take a product or a service, develop it, compete hard against competitors, and win. And you can even, and if you've given your best effort, we don't win every deal. And by the way, one of the things about the book I mentioned, Saving Capitalists from the Capitalists, is that business people have to be willing to continue to work the rules right. In other words, the goal as a business person is not just to figure out how you can exploit the rules. You want to have the game played right so that humans can continue to flourish. Now, in the United States, in the United States, there are different rules in different parts of the world. There's nothing illegal about having 100% market share if you've earned it. You have to earn it. You can't. Now, as you get closer to that, there's more and more suspicion from places like the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission and other competitors as well as to whether you really did earn it. But if you can have very high market shares if you in fact have earned them. But generally what you're doing is creating an environment where there is decent competition and you win. And that can be very satisfying. Those are just some examples, but certainly I would say that maybe I will add to it maybe a little more granular, and that is when I would go to India and see people, the satisfaction they had of building their skills. A lot of people hadn't had the opportunity to be trained to follow. We introduced the same processes and practices of quality, of safety. When I first went through factories in China, some of you know this, that we ended up buying. People were sitting, with no safety glasses on, no shoes and flip-flops, and sitting on tires, working in oil with chips around. We of course insist on the same safety practices everywhere in the world, including safety in what's released into the rivers. Much of the world has horribly polluted water, very sadly. So when people start realizing, hey, we're insisting on the same practices and the investments, when we have a sophisticated paint system in Brazil or China, it preserves the and processes the paint in exactly the same way we would do in Germany or the United States, where you have very high standards. Employees find that very satisfying. This is part of their life. They go home. They've learned things. They share. They're very proud to have their children come and work there. I love it when employees want their children to work at the same place where they do because they think you're a good employer. That's very satisfying for the employer. So I hope that's helpful, just as some examples. And some of you will be doing this in the years ahead, I'm sure. So what else? And then we'll kind of bring this to a close so we don't keep you all night. Yes, please, sir.
I'm constantly amazed at the demands that are placed on senior executives of major corporations in terms of travel and otherwise. Did you ever feel that the demands placed upon you caused you to lose balance in terms of your obligations to your family?
Yes. Would you please repeat the question? Yeah, thank you. So the question was that the demands on CEOs are very great, and sometimes you are working, I think I'll try to phrase it as a question, working so rigorously and around the world, can this get you out of balance with demands on your family? And my answer, simple answer, is yes. Now, I don't believe it needs to be that way on a sustained basis. It's hard to avoid it on an occasional basis. But I think that one of the things we try to do at John Deere is create a situation where it's probably about as good as you can, where people are working all around the world for a recognition that there's more to life than just the business. Now, for example, I offered a lot of jobs to people in the company over the years, and I always started off by saying, all I can do is tell you about what the company can offer. I do not know about the rest of your life. So this transfer that we're asking you to take to India or to China, I will tell you why I think it'll be good for your career, but that's only one dimension of your life. And I said this to every single person. Maybe you have a situation with a child, with a parent, with a spouse, where this doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't, you make the decision, don't take the job. Now, I'm not telling you won't miss out on a professional opportunity. Your career might not progress like it would otherwise, but you make the right decision for you. And one thing we did introduce was that we will not hold that against you for saying no. Okay? You might lose the opportunity. So it's important to make the judgments before you take a particular job, whether you're in a situation in that stage of your life to take it. And many people I know, I'm thinking of a particular executive who we were really convinced that this was the person to lead our China operations, and very high potential individual. And everybody tried to talk this individual into going, and he just kept saying no. And unfortunately, I didn't get the job totally done with everyone in the company to make that same statement. But I called him up and I told him exactly what I told you, and I was the leader of the company, and he ultimately decided not to take it. And I called him up after the decision. I tried to convince him to take it, but I said, it's open not to. He didn't take it. Afterwards, I called him and said, I'm glad you made the best decision for you. Full speed ahead. Keep doing what you're doing. This won't be held against you, but you won't get the experience of running that great market. Well, a few years later, another wonderful opportunity came along. We offered it to him. He took it, and I think he's just as well off. Now, it doesn't always happen that way, but in this case, it did. And I think if you make the right decisions for yourself in that regard. But there are times for travel, when you're traveling around the world, which leads me to a little story. Because my wife, who I mentioned earlier, was very much a partner in this journey. And when I learned that I was going to become the leader of the company, I came home and I shared with Patty that I was going to be the chairman of the company, and her instinctive reaction was, well, congratulations to us. That's what she said right away. And I was real happy about that, because it was a team, and we had worked together on this. But there are many needs, very many different needs of families, and they have to be recognized. And it may be that you decide not to pursue this if it doesn't make sense. And I would encourage people to opt out if it doesn't make sense. I also say to people, this was varsity level business that we were running. And I would share with people, not everybody wants to be in varsity level business. Intramurals is fine. And so it's not to say one ought to be working that intensely. But the type of work we had was very intense work. And when you're working that around the world like that, it takes a lot. And so, but I would say to people, it doesn't mean you should do this. Maybe you would be happier in a different situation, and I encourage you to do it. And I think that's the proper recognition of everybody's individual needs. I think in our company, there was generally, when a person got into a crisis situation, when people are working together for many, many years, there's a tendency to rally around, help a person out when something goes wrong, give it time off, a break, this type of thing. This helps when you have a culture like that can be done. So, yes, sir.
You've mentioned several ethics that you really tried to step forward for John Deere, and I was wondering if you could talk about a time when your ethics were challenged and you maybe yourself were tempted to stray away from these ethics to help the company move forward.
When was I tempted to stray from ethics? Well, first of all, I will say that working this hard and making the point to everybody, and making the point that we will walk away from our own earnings if it's going to hurt us. If we need to, and we had a process where there's bad news early, and there was very little penalty for bad news happens in any organization. As a human organization, there's bad news, and many of you know that in the businesses you run. And bad news would percolate up from all different places. There's only one really severe thing, and that was not to report it up. We wanted bad news early. We wanted to know what it was. We wanted it escalated. And the reason for that was often there's more knowledge at the top of the organization. We may know about other legal issues that might be involved, and so we want to know about bad news fairly early. And so often I would get bad news fairly quickly. Often one of the judgment calls I had to make was how much time to still, because people would come in early and they would say, I got bad news early, and fine, then come on in, tell me. That didn't necessarily mean I would solve it right away. First of all, often I didn't know how to solve it. But I would be aware of it. I would often bring in other people that needed to know about something, but often allow a manager to work on solving it. So often you have to figure out how much time to give for issues to be solved. But with a very strong statement like that, I would tell Wall Street, we're going to miss earnings. If we can't do it the right way, we will walk away from it. There are times when there are accounting judgments that you sit there and talk about. They're not black and white. They're gray. What is the right thing to do? Often you wrestle. That's why I say it's not simple. You wrestle with, what is the right thing to do? What is the right thing to do with the person that we're separating right now? What about, there was a Wall Street Journal article that said, quoted me, it was on the front page. You know how the Wall Street Journal has these little stick pictures, and they had a picture of me, and it was a statement that, the culture of the company is being destroyed, and there was a quote, we're not a family. And it went on to say that the CEO, that was me, had this bogus idea that dealers were not part of a family. And I made the pitch many times to employees and to dealers and to suppliers. There was this history that we were kind of a family. People liked that image. The Deere family. And dealers would be part of the family. And I was sharing over and over again, we are not a family. We're a high-performance team. There's a difference. So the Wall Street Journal reported, we are not a family. And it went on to say, this quoted that said many dealers were saying, hey, he's wrecking the culture. We've built this up. We've invested for years in our dealers, grandparents, parents, children. And now you're saying that we have to upgrade, or we have to merge, or we have to do something. And that was to meet the needs, the more sophisticated needs of our customers. And as I mentioned earlier, a consolidation of dealers. Well, I would share with people, we're not a family. I would say this is a compliment to a family, because in a family, if you're not pulling your weight, you're generally not out of the family, right? You're going to be in the family. But in a high-performance team, you're going to reach down many times. You're going to still help a person. That doesn't mean you're just going to throw them off the team. But over time, if you're not pulling your weight on a high-performance team, you're off. you're not there. And so we would say to suppliers or dealers, if you aren't pulling your weight, well, often it's a very tough judgment about if you're pulling your weight, and there are always extenuating circumstances. Well, here's the reason. First of all, your product, this is a lousy product. The reason I don't have a good market share is because you guys have not producing the product. Look at how it breaks. Look at the warranty claims on this. You can't blame me for not selling such a, and they often have very colorful words for a product in that situation. So there's judgment. There's judgment about what to do, and I'd say those judgment calls are much more where the difficulty is, but I don't think I was put under the situation where I was sort of really tempted to do the wrong thing. It was often finding out what was the right thing to do. And that is a different culture, because everybody said, and many of my employees have said to me, I never felt that I was asked to do the wrong thing. Now, we didn't always know what the right thing to do was, but I was never pressured, never asked, never implied, and that's a great place to work. And I recommend, there are a lot of places, we're not the only place like that, a lot of places like that, but that's the kind of place you want to work, if you possibly can. So I think maybe if there's one more, and then we'll bring this to an end. Is that good? Yes.
Looking from your role as chairman, CEO at the world, how did you contrast or get comfortable with nationalistic thoughts, Americans first kind of, versus the global world that we live in, balancing outsourcing of jobs, for instance, versus, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I often remind people in the United States is only 5% of the world's population. That's 95% isn't U.S., okay? An enormous amount of the opportunities outside the United States. The question was, what about nationalism? What about tensions between countries?
Perspective of taking care of America first versus addressing poverty in India and places like that.
Yeah. So the question is what about perspectives and taking care of poverty in India first? What about America first, and so forth? Well, our objective was to build a great business, a great global sustainable business that would last and take the company to its 200th birthday, and do all the things that were necessary to do that. And so the decisions we made about what would create a great, sustainable, enduring business, which means that the financial numbers are only a reflection of that. And then when you make that discussion, you say, well, should that product be built in India or should it be built in the U.S.? And of course, there's pressure. You end up, so we've had, if you look, there are lots of plants that got closed. It wasn't easy. We had employees who would sue us. I mean, this wasn't, I don't want to imply that this was always a happy time for decisions we would make. But we would believe we would make the effort to make the decision on what was right for the business for the long term. And it wasn't about, it was a business that, if you didn't do that, if we just said, well, let's put up the walls, let's try to do this in the U.S., take that India example I already gave. If we didn't build in India, then we would have been not protecting ourselves. So I think that was the way we did it. So I want to say thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for listening. What a privilege it is for me to talk with you.